Welcome to Top Kuna Productions. You're watching Top 10 Worst Plagues and Epidemics in Human History. Let's get started. The Antonine Plague. Location: the Roman Empire. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD, also known as the Plague of Galen, after Galen the physician who described it, was an ancient pandemic brought to the Roman Empire by troops who were returning from campaigns in the Near East. Scholars have suspected it to have either been smallpox or measles. Ancient sources agree that the plague appeared first during the Roman siege of the Mesopotamian city Seleucia in the winter of 165 through 66. It was reported that the plague spread to Gaul, to the legions along the Rhine. A large population died throughout the empire. According to the contemporary Roman historian Crassus Dio, the disease broke out again 9 years later, in 189 AD. And cost the lives of 2,000 people per day in Rome, ending the lives of 1/4 of those that were affected. The total death count has been estimated at around 5 million, and the disease killed as much as 1/3 of the population in some areas, and devastated the Roman army. It is speculated that the plague may also have broken out in eastern Han China before 166 because of notices of plagues in Chinese records. The plague affected Roman culture and literature and may have severely affected Indo-Roman trade relations in the Indian Ocean. The Plague of Athens. Location: Greece, Libya, Egypt, Ethiopia. The Plague of Athens was an epidemic that devastated the city-state of Athens in ancient Greece during the second year of the Peloponnesian War, when an Athenian victory still seemed within reach. The plague ended the lives of an estimated 100,000 people, around 1/4 of the population, and it is believed to have entered Athens through Piraeus, the city's port and sole source of food and supplies. Much of the eastern Mediterranean also saw an outbreak of the disease, albeit with less impact. The plague had a serious effect on Athens society, resulting in a lack of adherence to laws and religious belief. In response, laws became stricter, resulting in a punishment of non-citizens claiming to be Athenian. In addition, the leader of Athens died from the plague. The plague returned twice more, in 429 BC and in winter 427 BC. Some 30 pathogens have been suggested as having caused the plague. The plague was an unforeseen event that resulted in one of the largest recorded loss of life in ancient Greece, as well as a breakdown of Athenian society. The balance of power between citizens had changed due to many of the rich dying and their fortunes being inherited by remaining relatives of the lower class. Those who had become ill and survived were the most sympathetic to others suffering, believing that they could no longer succumb to any illness. A number of survivors offered to assist with the remaining sick. Plague also contributed to Athens' overall loss of power and ability to expand. Many of the remaining Athenians were found to be methics who had forged their documentation or had bribed officials to hide their original status. A number of these people were reduced to slaves once they were caught. This resulted in stricter laws dictating who can become an Athenian citizen, reducing both their number of potential soldiers and amount of political power, but also a decline in treatment and rights of methics in Athens. The plague dealt massive damage to Athens 2 years into the Peloponnesian War, from which it never recovered. Their political strength had weakened, and morale among their armies as well as citizens had fallen significantly. Athens would then go on to be defeated by Sparta and fall from being a major power in ancient Greece. The London Plague. In 1563, London experienced its worst episode of the plague during the 16th century. At least 20,000 people in London and surrounding parishes were recorded to have died of the plague during the outbreak. Around 24% of London's population ultimately perished, but the plague affected London's insanitary parishes and neighborhoods the most. The city of London was overcrowded, unsanitary, and poorly policed. Queen Elizabeth reigned in her 5th year, and the government struggled with a rapidly increasing population. Although sanitation was a constant problem, the city had gone over a dozen years without a plague epidemic, and many contemporary Londoners were unconcerned about the disease. That changed in 1563 when plague suddenly erupted in Derby, Leicester, and London with such virulence that the sickness spread to English troops garrisoned at Havre, weakening them and causing a surrender to French forces. The first cases of the plague began to appear in June. According to manuscripts by John Stowe, kept at Lambeth Library, weekly bills of mortality for 1563 show the first 17 recorded plague deaths for the week ending 12th of June. Elizabeth began coordinating a government response to the epidemic by communicating orders to her people through the church. Parishioners staying with those sick with the plague not to come to church until several weeks after they die or recover. Strict countermeasures were taken at the local level to combat the epidemic, such as painting blue crosses on houses of the infected and government orders to kill and bury all stray cats and dogs for the avoidance of the plague, with special officers appointed to carry out the cull. Many people still believed that the plague was caused by inhaling corrupt airs known as miasmas. In another well-intentioned but likely ineffective effort to cleanse London, orders were given by Queen Elizabeth's council on the 9th of July that all householders at 7 in the evening should make bonfires in the street to consume the corrupt air. Cases began to steadily increase over the next few weeks, with the plague killing 131 Londoners for the week ending on 3rd of July, before sharply increasing to hundreds of deaths per week by July 30th. The urban neighborhoods within London's walls were among the hardest hit by the epidemic of 1563, with the worst afflicted areas being St. Pulchre's Parish and Seacoles Lane, having large quantities of fruit merchandise and filth in the lanes, attracting rats. The areas around Fleet River were notorious for being overcrowded and unsanitary, and the plague spread wildly in those localities. The Italian Plague. The Italian Plague of 1629 through 1631 was a series of outbreaks of the bubonic plague that ravaged northern and central Italy. This epidemic, often referred to as the Great Plague of Milan, claimed possibly 1 million lives, or about 25% of the population. This episode is considered one of the later outbreaks of centuries-long pandemic of bubonic plague that began with the Black Death. The plague may have contributed to the decline of Italy's economy relative to that of other Western European countries. German and French troops carried the plague to the city of Mantua in 1629. As a result of troop movements associated with the 30 Years' War, Venetian troops infected with the disease retreated into northern and central Italy, spreading the infection. In October 1629, the plague reached Milan, Lombardy's major commercial center. Although the city initiated effective public health measures, including quarantine and limiting access to trade goods, the plague smoldered. A major outbreak in March 1630 resulted from relaxed health measures during the carnival season. This was followed by a second wave in the spring and summer of 1631. Overall, Milan suffered approximately 60,000 fatalities, out of a total population of 200,000. East of Lombardy, the Republic of Venice was infected in 1630 through 1631. The city of Venice was severely hit, with recorded casualties of 64,000. The plague also spread north into Tyrol and Alpine regions of western Austria and northern Italy. Later outbreaks of the bubonic plague in Italy occurred in the city of Florence in 1630 through 1633 and areas surrounding Naples, Rome, and Genoa in 1656 through 57. The Japanese smallpox epidemic. The Japanese smallpox epidemic was a major smallpox epidemic that afflicted much of Japan, killing approximately 1/3 of the entire Japanese population. The epidemic had significant social, economic, and religious repercussions throughout the country. A few decades prior to the outbreak, Japanese court officials had adopted a Chinese policy of reporting disease outbreaks among the general population. This recording practice greatly facilitated the identification of smallpox as the disease that afflicted Japan during the year 737. Increased contact between Japan and the Asian mainland had led to more frequent and serious outbreaks of infectious diseases. The smallpox epidemic of 735 through 737 was recorded as having taken hold around August 735 in northern Kyushu, where the infection had ostensibly been carried by Japanese fishermen who had contracted the illness after being stranded on the Korean peninsula. The disease spread rapidly throughout northern Kyushu that year and persisted into the next. By 736, many land tenants in Kyushu were either dying or forsaking their crop, leading to poor agricultural yields and ultimately famine. Also in 736, a group of Japanese governmental officials passed through northern Kyushu while the epidemic was intensifying. As members of the party sickened and died, the group gave up on their intended mission to the Korean peninsula. Returning to the capital with smallpox, the officials supposedly had spread the disease to eastern Japan, and the disease continued to ravage the entirety of Japan. In 737, one manifestation of the pandemic's great impact was by August of 737, a tax exemption had been extended to all Japan, based on fiscal reports of adult mortality. For smallpox epidemic of 735 through 737 has been estimated at 35% of Japan's entire population, with some areas experiencing much higher rates. All levels of society were affected. The Great Balkan Plague. The Great Plague of 1738 was an outbreak of the bubonic plague between 1738 and 1740 that affected areas in the modern nations of Romania, Hungary, Ukraine, Serbia, Croatia, and Austria. Although no exact figure is available, the epidemic likely killed over 50,000 people. Southeastern Transylvania may have been the hardest hit over the following 8 years. Over the following 8 years, the pandemic killed a sixth of the population in Timisoara, and the disease spread extended to the Adriatic. It made its way to the island of Brač in modern-day Croatia. By the summer, the Serbian region of Grad Zrenjanin was also affected. The Great Pestilence. The Great Pestilence is a term given to the disease that caused millions of deaths in the territory of New Spain in present-day Mexico in the 16th century, attributed to a mysterious illness characterized by high fevers and bleeding. It ravaged the Mexican highlands in epidemic proportions and had devastating effects on the area's demography, particularly for the indigenous people. Based on the death toll, this outbreak is often referred to as the worst disease epidemic in the history of Mexico. Subsequent outbreaks continued to baffle both Spanish and native doctors, with little consensus among modern researchers. However, recent bacterial studies have shown it most likely to have been Salmonella. It may have also been an indigenous viral fever, perhaps exacerbated by the worst droughts that affect the region in 500 years, as well as living conditions for indigenous peoples of Mexico in the wake of the Spanish conquest. The Great Plague of Vienna. The Great Plague of Vienna occurred in 1679 in Vienna, Austria, the imperial residence of Austrian Habsburg rulers. From contemporary descriptions, the disease is believed to have been the bubonic plague, which is carried by fleas associated with the black rat and other rodents. The city was crippled by the epidemic, which reoccurred in the early 1680s, claiming an estimated 76,000 residents. Vienna, located on the river Danube, was a major trading crossroads between east and west. As a result of this traffic, the city had suffered from episodic plague outbreaks since the first wave of the Black Death in the 14th century. The city was crowded and densely built. Descriptions indicate that there were no public sewers or drainage systems, with stinking mounds of domestic garbage littering the streets. In addition, warehouses for trade goods, which held items such as clothing, carpets, and grain for months at a time, were heavily infested with rats. Conditions in the city were considered so unhealthy and filthy, even for the time. A religious order operating in Vienna, the Brotherhood of the Holy Trinity, created special hospitals for both children and adults during the 1679 epidemic. The basic nursing care offered in the hospitals was simple. Doctors treated patients by doing bloodlettings and applying noxious ointments. The corpses of plague victims were carted to the outer edges of the city and placed in large open pits for burning. However, the pits were exposed to open air for several days until they were nearly full, allowing ongoing infection of the rat population. The Ottoman Plague. The 1812 through 1819 Ottoman Plague epidemic was one of the last major epidemics of plague in the Ottoman Empire. This particular epidemic would cost the lives of at least 300,000 individuals. The disease broke out in the capital, Constantinople, in July 1812. It was initially mild, but by late August the situation became critical. By September, around 2,000 people were dying each day. In December, the epidemic subsided but later reappeared. The outbreak spread throughout most of the empire's territory, including Alexandria in Egypt. In 1813, the plague reached the Ottoman vassal state of Wallachia. The epidemic killed about 30,000 people in Bucharest alone. Around the same time, the plague was also present in Bosnia, reaching Dalmatia in 1815. In 1814, it appeared in Egypt, Bosnia, and Albania. The plague also spread beyond the borders of the empire. In May 1812, it ended in Georgia. In September, Crimea was hit. It had reached Odessa in August, where the churches, the theater, and the exchange was closed. On the 7th of January 1813, no more cases were reported from Odessa, and the town was reopened after 66 days, but no one was allowed to leave the city. The epidemic killed 3,000 people in 1812. Counties in Moldavia and the southern of Ukraine had to deal with the plague. In March 1813, it was introduced at the British-held island of Malta, causing an epidemic which lasted until January 1814 and killed around 5,000 people. The epidemic spread from Malta to the nearby island of Gozo. A small plague outbreak which occurred in Noia, Italy in 1815 might have also originated from the epidemic in Dalmatia, but its exact source is not known. It is possible that the outbreak was endemic. The Black Death. The Black Death, also known as the pestilence, the Great Mortality, or the Plague, was the deadliest pandemic recorded in human history. The Black Death resulted in deaths up to 200 million people in Eurasia and North Africa, peaking in Europe from 1347 to 1351. The plague was caused by a Y. pestis infection. Most commonly results in the bubonic plague, but can also cause septicemic or pneumonic plagues. The Black Death was the beginning of the second plague pandemic. The plague created religious, social, and economic upheavals, with profound effects on the course of European history. The Black Death most likely originated in Central or East Asia, from where it traveled along the Silk Road, reaching Crimea by 1347. From there it was most likely carried by fleas living on black rats that traveled on merchant ships, spreading throughout the Mediterranean basin and reaching Africa, Western Asia, and the rest of Europe via Constantinople, Sicily, and the Italian peninsula. Current evidence indicates that once it came on shore, the Black Death was in large part spread by human fleas and the person-to-person contact which pneumonic plague enables, thus explaining the very fast inland spread of the epidemic, which was faster than would be expected if the primary vector was rat fleas causing the bubonic plague. The Black Death was the second disaster affecting Europe during late Middle Ages, the first one being the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and it is estimated to have killed to 60% of Europe's total population. The plague may have also reduced the world population from an estimated 500 million to 350 million in the 14th century. There were other outbreaks throughout the late Middle Ages, and with other contributing factors, it took until the year 1500 for the European population to regain the levels of the year 1300. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and to share this video with your friends. If you really enjoyed this video, consider supporting me on Patreon. Every donation is greatly appreciated. Link is in the description box below. Thank you for watching.